Welcome to Blue Collar ICs, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on interventional cardiology. Hosted by Jordy Collada, Bill Dixon, Brian Brown, and Todd Floor, this is where real doctors talk real work. From the cath lab to complex cases, new devices, and hard-earned lessons, these are the conversations that don't happen in textbooks. No hype, no fluff. Just experience, expertise, and straight talk. Welcome to the conversation. This is Blue Collar ICs.
All right, welcome in to another edition of Blue Collar ICs as we have a interesting discussion set up this week. And as always, we're brought to you by Salus Scientific. Remember, over at Salus Scientific, they are redefining radiation safety. I should say we are. I am a part of Salus Scientific's family and part of the great message and the great products that we are out there talking about radiation protection, living radiation protection. We have G-Lift, we have standard lead, we have all types of cool products as far as radiation protection is concerned. If you want to learn more, you can always log online to salusscientific.com. And shout out to our guy, John, over at RealWorks Media, who helps us keep staying on time all week. We're looking forward to the discussion this week. We've got a couple of special guests, including interventional radiologist Dr. Jeffrey Hull and Rob Williamson, who's been a part of some really cool startups as far as bringing products to market that Dr. Bill Dixon, our interventional cardiologist, and Dr. Brian Brown, interventional cardiologist, are looking forward to having a cool discussion this week. So, fellas, welcome aboard to Blue Collar ICs. We appreciate your time. Dr. Bill Dixon and Dr. Brian Brown, it's good to see you guys again. Dr. Dixon, a little bit about our guest and what our topics this week are going to consist of.
Yeah, so Rob Williamson, I met Rob through involvement with Shockwave, and we stayed friends even after that. Rob's a good guy. Rob's been at several companies that are startups that he can tell us about. And Brian and I were talking, a good topic we thought was, how do you come up with an idea as an engineer or a med device person or a physician and say, wow, this is a really cool idea. What does it take to actually get that idea into motion and to market? And Rob's been involved with several companies very early on that have been very successful. So we'll get his insight. And Brian, you want to introduce Dr. Hull?
I had the honor of meeting Dr. Hull on a few occasions and just having lovely dinners and hearing a lot about history, about where he started back at Duke, what he did there, what his career looked like as an interventional radiologist in Richmond, and then how he came up with an idea. And by going through that process can give a lot of insight to everybody that has an idea of what's realistic and what's not. So it was an honor. Thank you for you both coming on the show.
Sure.
Pleasure.
So I want to point out, I'm also a Dookie, and I've got him winning the whole thing in my pool. So we'll see.
Yeah, me too. But this is a little interesting at that. I better knock on some wood quick.
Why don't we do introductions for both of you from yourselves as well?
Yeah.
So we'll start with you, Dr. Hull, and then we'll go to you, Rob.
So, since we're talking about med device, I think I probably started the med device thing at about the right time. You have to have some experience. I think when people are right out of the gate, they don't really probably, unless they're into some heavy science thing, probably don't really know their field well enough to, kind of get things going. And so I think I was about in my mid 40s, and a friend of mine asked me, hey, what's something that you do that could be greatly improved by making it minimally invasive? And I right away just said, AV fistula. It's and now part of the real history of that is I had when you train at Duke, you do your third year in research, and I had done cardiothoracic surgery with Jim Cox, who was doing left atrial isolation, the Maze procedure, and we were experimenting on animals, which was pretty popular back in the day. And, you begin to realize you did these took these rather simple, basic devices, you sort of perfected them in the lab, and not too much longer, you've sterilized them and we're using them in people. So that was back in the day. I think it's a little harder these days, but it was just a great background to realize that what it takes to take an idea, prove it, some sort of level, either in the animal lab or some other type situation, and then bring it to human. So I'd sort of walked that path a little bit in medical school, which was super helpful later in life. Because you still need to do all that stuff, to bring something that's really novel. Generally, you have to vet it out on every level. So, and we could talk more about how those ideas come. One of the things I think every interventionalist I've ever met has a great idea. And they usually think about like a widget or hey, I want to, I'm treating thoracic dissections with stint grafts, and gee, if I had some way to cut the between the false and true lumen, that'd be really great. It's just something. There's, they're living it, and they want to kind of they come up with ideas on how to fix the problem. And I think the guys that I work with.
Did you guys lose the audio for Jeff?
Not me.
No, you're
I can
good.
hear.
Oh, we're good. Okay. So, I think it's the way my guys work, and is that you think of a really, really big problem, and then you try to solve it, as opposed to starting with the widget and working from there. So I've met innumerable colleagues who have an idea, they patent it, they spend a lot of money, they won't talk to anybody about it because they're afraid someone's going to steal their idea. And, 3, 4, 5 years later, it's, kind of too late. So you really, it's hard to steal somebody's idea, because if it's really novel, it's going to cost $50 million to get it through the FDA. So, you need a lot of help. And I think the other thing is, don't start with a solution, but start with the problem and come up with the best way to solve it.
What was your reaction to that, Dr. Dixon?
Well, first of all, it takes incredible courage to come up with an idea and then take it through all the steps. It can be pretty daunting, I think. Like, my first question was, well, do you patent your idea so no one steals it?
Yeah.
And different companies have ways that you can submit an idea to them. I did that once with a sheath with Terumo, and it didn't go anywhere. But you have an idea and you don't know if somebody else has already thought of it, but should you patent it first? At what point do you patent it? And then, Jeff's done this. So he said it takes $50 million to get through the FDA. And I think about, well, depending on what your device is, how do you find somebody to manufacture it and engineer it and all of that? So it just seems to me very, very daunting.
Yeah, I think so. I was lucky that I kind of hooked up with a team that had already done that. They had initially come up with a percutaneous breast biopsy system back in the 90s with Steve Parker. And then a friend of mine developed the anchor that's used to do arthroscopic repair of rotator cuff. And this was the next project. So this team of engineers was looking for a problem statement, looking for a big problem to solve. And then everybody starts working on ideas on how to solve it. And you have engineers thinking about it from an engineering standpoint. You've got people like myself considering the clinical side. So and then you work your way up to your first patent. And when you've kind of come up with a reasonable way to solve a really big problem. And when I say that, part of it is, if you're going to raise $40 or $50 million, you got to have to sell it for $500 million to sort of recoup the risk. especially early on. So you don't want to take something that you're only going to make 1,000 of, or, you need to make a big number of them, or they need to be very expensive, or both. And so that you can go out and raise money. And it's surprising. It's like once you know that there's a lot of people that are looking for good projects, all of a sudden it's not that hard. What you really need to do is if you got a really big problem you want to solve, and you start talking to people, you'll find that there are groups of engineers, marketing people who raise money, people who have the regulatory and billing expertise to get you through all the various phases. And typically you start with your ideas, your patents, and so forth, and you make bunker patents. So not only do you patent your idea, but you patent everything around it that could be, some way for other people to get into it. You have to do your basic science work, whether that's in animals or something else, and that's expensive. That's always interesting to talk about, where places to do that. So it's as I like to say, you die a million deaths. It's you come up with your idea, and I'll take just the AV fistula as an example. It's like, well, how are we going to move the vein over to the artery? And if you don't solve that problem, if your widget doesn't do that, or you can't figure that out, you're done. You don't have anything. So now it turns out, we did it by studying the anatomy and found that if you trace the perforating vein down from the two median cubital veins where you'd normally start an IV, that perforating vein in over 90% of patients comes straight down and touches the proximal radial artery. So you can, that's your connection point. Now you don't have to take the vein and free it up and move it. You just use the body's anatomy to make that happen. So, and then and then if you don't have a good way to connect the artery and vein, you've died, your program is over. So you have to keep, each challenge you have to meet, and you do it over and over and over again. So it's a very repetitive process in that regard.
So what I hear you say is have everybody focus on solving a big problem. Start there, try to push the widgets aside. And as far as patenting something, that comes later once it's kind of more realistic. Is that kind of the gist?
You want the best solution, because if you start with and you see it all the time, if you start with a solution, you're trying to make it work. And how does that, and one of the ways that plays out is, I've got this thrombectomy device. Thrombectomy device is classic. It's like where good ideas go to die. You say, okay, I've got this, I'm going to do this thing, this thrombectomy, and I'm going to do it this way. And then you get halfway through and it doesn't work, or you decide, it doesn't really remove this kind of clot or that kind of clot. And maybe it would be a good neuroprotection device when we're doing carotid thinning, or, and then you change, you can't afford to change your focus, because you just can't, you run out of money, so it's really important to spend a long time getting the problem right. And I see Rob nodding his head, so I was going to let him.
Yeah. So Rob, Jeff has kind of just talked a little bit about, you get an idea, and I've had ideas, and the first thing I do is worry somebody's going to steal it. But he was fortunate to have some people that had some resources and infrastructure in place to help test the idea and that kind of thing. So give everybody your background in the med device industry. Where'd you start? Where are you now? What happened in between?
So I couldn't have a more different background from Jeff than I do. I did not go to Duke by any stretch of the imagination. I almost failed out of state school, right? Moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and became a fly fishing hippie for about a year and a half after school. And only when I ran out of money did I go into sales because I didn't know how to do anything else. And so my first job was actually with Bard Peripheral. And so it's funny, I cut my teeth learning from interventional radiologists like Sahil Sadegni at UAB basically taught me the peripheral business. That was my first job 30 years ago, was working with him. What I figured out about working those early days when peripheral and cardiology were just sort of starting up on the interventional side, that it was really fun to introduce new technology and change standard of care. So anytime we had a chance to be able to say, here's status quo today, and it's not enough, right? Patients deserve better and doctors deserve better. Let's go design a product that can work better, give us better outcomes for patients and easier ways of doing that for doctors. And I just became addicted to that. We launched something like 14 new products in 5 years at Bard. And all I knew at that point is that I could never go work for another big company. I had to go work for small companies that were launching game-changing technology. So first startup for me was Fox Hollow Technologies, which was a John Simpson company. John Simpson was the one that came in with the first over-the-wire balloon angioplasty. He was Andreas Grunzig's best friend. Andreas Grunzig designed angioplasty. He's the guy that basically invented interventional cardiology. From there over to EV3, another startup that was on the interventional neuro side, cardiology side, and peripheral side. Shockwave Medical, which I think most of you guys have probably heard of. And so Shockwave was a startup that we just recently sold to J&J and had a nice exit with that. But I was there as the first commercial sales employee. I went in as their founding VP of sales, hired a sales team, took them through FDA approval, took them through commercialization, took them through IPO, and then ultimately took them almost up to the point where they sold to J&J. And then now, most recently, and Jordy may kick me off for this, but I've come back out of a little stint away from the medical device business and relaxing for a little bit of time after 8 straight years of pretty hardcore, intense startup mode at Shockwave. But I'm now at Rampart as the Chief Revenue Officer, which we are also in the radiation protection business and make equipment that tries to get people out of lead for interventional procedures that are exposed to radiation for 2 reasons. One is so that we can protect them from the radiation for obvious reasons and cancer risk, but secondarily, and maybe even more frequently, is the ability to get them out of lead to protect them from orthopedic injury. And so, yeah, that's 30 years, 4 startups, a couple of bigger companies, and what I figured out is that I'm a startup guy, true and true.
Thank you for telling us all that. I saw you at CRT from afar, but I don't think we actually got introduced. If we did, I apologize. Every meeting for me it's a lot in a small amount of time and a fair amount of beers. I first met Bob Foster, the founder, when he was training me vein ablation in Alabama. So I drove a Dodge Challenger Hellcat with my partner, Alejandro Lopez, over there, and we learned, and the reason he had this big vein clinic was his back hurt. He's passionate about it. He said, Brian, look for Rampart. This is coming out. So I followed all that. And then mostly at the beginning, as you know, in the CTO space, that's where everyone really grabbed onto it. Long procedures, not moving anything around. You guys have had a million iterations since then and are continuing to iterate. But what's cool about the radiation reduction space is you're trying to help not just doctors, but techs, nurses, everyone in the room. And it is not a device that you have to worry about as the reimbursement for this.
Yeah.
You just have to worry if the hospital system or the practice can buy the product. And obviously, it's already the best way to buy it is when you're building a new lab. It's
That's right.
Cost, not an add-on cost later on. But
that's right. Very, very true. It's interesting. After 27 years of being solely focused on patient outcomes, I'm at a point in my career now where the mission of the company is the most important endeavor for me, right? And so to be able to turn to HCPs and say, your current working environment, you deserve better, right? There's no reason that you should have to today with the technologies that we have to offer to be exposed to the radiation that you're being exposed to. And if you look at the stats are staggering. If you've been in a cath lab, vascular surgery, interventional radiology, basically, if you've been wearing lead for 20 years, there's a 2 in 3 chance that you have some type of orthopedic injury. And so, the mission of this company is that we've got to do better. And it was founded by Bob Foster's desire to get back in the lab because his career had been taken away from him because he ruptured 2 discs in his lumbar spine.
So I wanted to go back real quick to Dr. Hull's point. You were talking about how solve the big problem. Well,
the radiation space is solving a big problem, but you did solve a big problem. You said, all right, how can I do percutaneous AV access? How did you and when did you pivot and say, wow, we made a really cool device. We might have somewhere else we could use it in. How early did that happen where you thought it could be used for DVA?
This is sort of interesting because it kind of harkens back to the Duke story, that I had always, I remember first time reading about an anastomosis, and I thought, wow, that's a really cool thing. You kind of have to sew this thing together, but it's really the linchpin of all the vascular surgery procedures. And it'd be really cool to have other ways to do it. So it was always sort of in the back of my mind. And so when I chose to say, okay, let's make an AV fistula, it was because it was the easiest place to do it. It was on the arm. It was going to, you start in the heart, you've got such a mountain, to climb, safety and efficacy and numerous other, all the things that go along with that. So the arm just seemed like a much easier place to start. But we always thought that, well, if we perfected the sutureless anastomosis, it's immediate, permanent, balloon dilatable, where you can adjust the flow of it. You could use it for a lot of things, and maybe even coronary someday, or maybe bypass. It's just and then so the next thing that we did was to do deep venous arterialization to prevent amputation in diabetics, and that was a pretty natural transition for us because the tibial artery and vein lie right next to each other and touch. So you really, and for long segments, so you can kind of make that almost anywhere along the course of that. So that was always something. It's so expensive. Everyone always says, "Oh, why don't you just improve this product?" It's like, well, because it costs a couple $1 million. That's why. And you have to go through a lot of regulatory stuff, and then you got to get it paid for. And it's and being a small company, I agree with Rob. It's like the only place to be because big companies are unwieldy and very risk averse. So it's really cool to be on the cutting edge in developing these technologies. But you're limited in how far you can go.
So you mentioned you threw a number out, $50 million. So you have a product, a device, but you have to raise money to do the next step, get it to the FDA. And I don't know all the ins and outs. There's different series of fundraising. Rob, can you talk about that for a second, how that works?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind touching on that at all. It's kind of interesting as Jeff is talking. Jeff represents sort of the visionary, the inventor, and I represent of how do we take that and give it legs and actually give it commercialization and go through all the steps to be able to give us a healthy way to be able to get this to patients, right? Nothing works if we don't get these solutions to patients, and it takes a lot of money and a lot of different steps to be able to do that. Let me just tell a quick story about this you guys will appreciate. So from an inventing standpoint, the founder of Shockwave Medical, which is the biggest startup I've been a part of, right, of the four that I was with, that one started with a cup of coffee and the patent applications that the federal government makes public once a week. So imagine your way of getting your weekend started right is to pour a big cup of coffee and look through all the patent applications and say, is there a good idea that I can generate out of this? And Daniel Hawkins, the founder of Shockwave, was looking through these patent applications and saw something in there about sonic therapy and lithotripsy and this idea of being able to use sound waves to be differential in their disruption of being able to be hard on hard and soft on soft. And this patent application had something to do with an iterative version of what they used to break up kidney stones. And the thought came to Daniel, wait a minute, so there's a big problem with calcium in the vasculature all over the body, coronary and peripheral. If it's hard on hard and soft on soft, why has nobody ever thought about doing this? He calls a friend of his who is one of the godfathers of the pacemaker business, electrical engineer guy, right? And says, why has nobody ever thought about using lithotripsy in a different application? He goes, I have no idea. And he said, can you miniaturize this and maybe put it inside of an angioplasty balloon and see if we can actually use this to keep the soft, healthy tissue in place, but be able to go through that and get to the deep wall, heavy calcium, and be able to break that up in a very non-disruptive way. And he said, I'm a GD electrical engineer. I can do whatever I want to, was basically his response to him. And so that is how Shockwave Medical was born, was two guys that were crazy enough to come up with an idea, right? They said, let's do this. They self-funded through their first sort of version of these products, using little water baths and using calcium rings that they had built themselves to break these things up. And then they go to Fred Moll. Fred is the inventor of the Da Vinci robot and Intuitive Surgical. He's the founder of that. They go to Fred and say, you might be the third person that's crazy enough to help us with this idea. We don't really have any other money right now. Could you possibly help us get this thing started? Fred ended up becoming the chairman of the board for Shockwave Medical in those early days. And so it's so interesting when you think about how these companies, the inventiveness and the vision of guys like Jeff have. I love that part of it because I don't have that at all. What I do is I have the ability to be able to go and say, your idea is here. Now, how do we build a business around that? How do we market this? How do we make it sure it gets to patients? And so, long story short, the way that you then do that is that you've got to have some money to get through these steps. So there's a few steps that are there. One is going to be called what we talked about with Fred Moll, and another guy whose parents actually funded about $400,000 of the early stage of Shockwave as well. And that's called seed money or angel money, right? So that's the money that you go around and beg with your cup and, on the street corner say, can someone give us some money to be able to get this thing started? Typically, once you have a proof of concept of some kind at that point, then you would go and say, we want to do an early round, right, a round A kind of thing. But you've got to be able, before you go to the venture capital markets, private equity markets, anything like that, or go to the banks, you've got to have some proof of concept. So that angel money is really important. Jeff will tell you the same thing. You've got to find a few people that are willing to take a risk with you early to prove that concept before you get into some actual commercial rounds of funding. Now, the dance that you always have to go through there, Bill and Brian, is that you've got to find this way to try to be able to preserve some capital, right? Because every time you raise money, you're diluting your ownership in that company. So you're trying to preserve as much of the capital as you can while at the same time get the funding that you need to be able to take those next steps of the company. Shockwave, for example, I think we were about $140 million is what we raised before we took that company public. And that was in 4 different rounds and a couple of extensions within those rounds. And then even after we took the company public, we did another second IPO just to make sure that we had enough money in the bank before we hit COVID, right? So we went public in 19, COVID hit in 20. We wanted to make sure we had enough money in the bank. And so funding is sort of this living, breathing animal that can come in multiple different ways from multiple different sources, both institutional and independent. And then ultimately, if you're fortunate or unfortunate enough to take your company public, then it comes from shareholders, right?
I was in training when you guys had that IPO. My attending Peter Sukis was heavily involved with you guys. He told us about it. And, you got Robinhood on your phone and you look around at stuff, but what you don't have as a fellow is literally any money. And so I remember watching it when it came out, and I think it went from like 30 something to 50 something. And I remember just being, maybe it was 60 something, but I just remember being like, well, that's over. Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Over. So we went public at 17, right? So we went public at 17. We had, I think it was $970 million value. So we missed a unicorn IPO by just a smidge. We sold that company to J&J for $335 a share, and I think it was about 4 years later, from 17. So not every run ends with a Cinderella story like that, but I think it really goes back to a couple of things. One, did you have an unmet need, right? Was there a significant unmet need? 2, was the market big enough that people were interested in investing in it? And then 3, is your technology differentiated enough? Does it work well enough to go take advantage of that market? And then for me, it's put the right team in place so that we can actually execute on the commercial strategy.
All right, this is for both of you. This is more like next level stuff, but both of your companies got a permanent code. Now, you both did, correct, Jeff? You guys had a percutaneous officially creation code.
Right.
And I know Shockwave does. I know Lithotripsy does. But how did you all work through that, or how involved were either of you with that?
Now, I think Rob made a really good point, and it kind of dovetails back to what you guys were asking. It's like, hey, I've got an idea. How do I start? It's like, you really need all these people. You need all that stuff Rob just talked about. You need engineers, you need regulatory experts, you need fundraising experts, you need real business people. I always worry when someone tells me they invented something and that they're going to be CEO of the company. I'm like, that's that's like a totally different skill set. You might have it, but you've been like a resident and then a fellow and a attending for a few years. So, you might not. And you really got to pull together an A team. This is, you can't really have the B team really in any of these positions. So how do you get a code?
That's the second time I've heard that this weekend. Be wary of the physician CEO inventor.
Yes. Yeah. So getting a code. So basically, if let's say your idea is really novel enough that it is worthy of a new code, and that's so anytime you're doing true innovation, other than small iterative changes where you're just doing a 510K, you're going to have to get a new code, and that's what we call the donut. Maybe Rob doesn't call it that, but you get FDA approval, and now you've got to raise enough money to get through the next 4 or 5 years, depending on what's going on, to get reimbursement. And there are certain codes you can get. You can get a C code. But you need real experts for this. This is not, anything for the junior varsity to be, working on. You've got to have 5 publications in the U.S. by different authors. There's a series of things. So you really want to get experts on reimbursement to get you from regulatory through what you've gotten through regulatory approval. Now you've got this next huge hurdle, which is reimbursement. Rob, but when you probably can do a better job of explaining that than I can.
Right. Well, it's funny when it comes to startup companies, people always see that, they see the headline that says, "This is what you sold your company for." And everybody goes, "Ooh, what a great experience. That must have been awesome." What they don't realize is there's about 10 near-death experiences that happened in the early days of those companies where we were sitting up at night going, I don't know if we're going to make it or not, right? I don't know if we're going to make payroll or not. I don't know if the product's going to work or not. Or if we actually do make a product that works and we get the FDA to bless it, can we get anybody to pay for it, right? And so that's the part for us. And our near-death experience when it came to reimbursement was we thought that we were going to use atherectomy codes as an IVL intravascular lithotripsy device. We thought that we could cheat off those codes. Cheat's probably too strong a word. We were using similar technology, sort of 510K. We had a 510K specialty angioplasty approval so that we thought we could just sort of move over and bump elbows with the atherectomy crowd because there was some really nice reimbursement associated with atherectomy. Well, the FDA came back to us and said, it's a new day, son. You don't get to just rub elbows with atherectomy because you think you're supposed to, right? You're going to have to figure out your own way to go get reimbursement. And that was one of those near-death experiences for us because we had no idea how to go build our own code. And so we went through about...
What you did was better than an atherectomy code.
But Brian, we didn't know it was going to be better. We thought it was going to be the end of the company, right? And so we went through about 4 different reimbursement consultants and fired 3 of the 4. The last one we had finally said to us, you guys are going to have to do the hard work to do this, but if we take 2 years and go build this thing the right way, here's the way CMS works. And if we can get CMS to look at it this way, we've got a chance. And we were very fortunate, right? We worked really hard. We made sure that everything that we did, we stayed within the letter of law of what we needed to do for CMS and for reimbursement. And we made sure that the way that we built our pricing structure, our commercialization structure, gave us a chance to be able to not just get our own code, but have a code that was actually going to be reimbursed in a way that could be a profit center for the hospital and not something that was going to be negative to margins every time they pulled it. Think about DCBs, right? I was part of the launch of DCBs in the peripheral space. Great product. Absolutely great. It's used in almost every case that's out there, but it's margin negative every time they pull the product. And so we learned a lot from that process that when we launched IVL, we knew that our pricing structure had to be a certain way in order for us to not just get TPT and NTAP, but we needed long-term permanent reimbursement so that we didn't get into trouble with the CFO of the hospital every time they used the product.
Because you created that, now there are 10 new companies trying to get their product approved with that code.
That's right. And $1 billion in sales, right? I mean, we're talking about IVL. There's still only one company. There's one other one that launched a few weeks ago. Yeah, but we did $1 billion in sales last year, or right around that number.
So Jordy, we kind of skipped a big step. So you have an idea, you find friends with money or really cool tool sets where they can make stuff. You raise more money, but then you have to apply to the FDA to get your device approved, not paid for, just approved. And there's a couple of pathways. So you've heard people mention 510K. Correct me, guys, if I'm wrong, but that's a device that you say it's really similar to something already out there. So we don't think we have to start over. We want to kind of lump off this one. And then you have a breakthrough device. If something is completely new that saves life or limb, then you might get some kind of fast track through the FDA. But you have to get one of those approvals. And often you're trying to raise money at the same time. And then I don't know exactly what the requirements are for research. It's too expensive to do randomized studies for a startup. So you're doing registries and single arm and that kind of thing to try and get some data. I don't think the FDA uses out of the U.S. data that often, that you got to be your own in U.S. data, right? Is that accurate for the FDA or?
It's generally true, but I know of occasional people that have gotten through without U.S. data. But it's rare. But U.S. data is usually more expensive. It's just.
Yep. Now these private equity and venture capitalists, before they put their money in, they want to talk to somebody that does this for a living and say, do you really think this is going to work? I was fortunate to get involved with Shockwave very early. Shockwave became commercially available March 2017, I think. That's right. We had it in July 2017 in my hospital with no code or anything. And then I was asked to get on a call with an investment group in like August, September, because they wanted to talk to people who had had a chance to use it. What do you think? You think this has a future? But the venture capital companies, they don't always know who Bill Dixon is, so they may go to more recognizable names in industry, the mafia that controls some of this stuff and get their opinion. But I think, and both of you guys to talk about this, once you get it to market or get it into the study phase, you want people that do this every day for a living that will tell you, yeah, this is good or this is not good. This will work. It won't work. Can you guys talk about that a little bit?
Jeff, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our company it was kind of easy because I was doing them, so it's, and I was one of the founders. Right. Yeah. So let's say you're not a physician or it's not in your specialty and you are looking for basically adopters, somebody who's going to adopt your technology and use it they're going to use it prolifically. They are going to use it for everything it's good for and find out, what it works with, what it doesn't work with. And you need that guy. You need somebody that is really going to be a champion of it. And it's not always the well-known KOL who does that. A lot of times they do just a few cases and they're usually, they do a lot of talking, but they're not often the person that, the full all-in adopter. And you really need that guy, Bill. I mean, Rob, what do you think? Is that something?
Would it be safe to say you guys would go look for a blue collar operator?
Right. We certainly did. And here's the thing: our first sales pitch at Shockwave sounded something like this. I've got a really expensive product. It has absolutely zero reimbursement. I cannot put it on consignment for you because we don't have the financial viability to do it. And by the way, I'm not sure if it works or not. How many would you like to buy? Right? Bill was crazy enough to take that risk with me. But yeah, I would say, most of the time, the venture capital and the bankers, they call us and say, can you give us the names of a few people? And by the way, what that means is we'd like to know who you want us to talk to, and then we're going to talk to 15 others that you didn't give us the names of, right? Because they're going to really pressure test this thing. But what they try to do is to see, where is your influence, right? Who are the folks that you're working with? At Shockwave, we were very, very prescriptive about wanting to make sure that we had a good mix of academic, very influential centers. We also had people that had podium presence that were influential within the space, but we also had folks that were just part of large community-based hospitals that were using this thing on an everyday basis. The key here is that we wanted to keep a really tight feedback loop, right? And then once we knew that this product was working, we wanted our investors to be able to talk with them and have those confirmations/affirmations that we were making progress and we were a good investment for them.
You guys, would you say you started more in the peripheral space then?
Yes, we did, because peripheral, keep in mind, a 510K is available for the peripheral vasculature. You cannot do a 510K for coronary. So you have to go make a PMA, right? So it is easier to get into the peripheral space. Most of that is driven by the fact that if you have a complication in the peripheral arteries, it's typically a little more forgiving than if you have a complication in coronaries. And so there's a lot more rigor on the clinical side that you've got to prove on the coronary interventional side than the peripheral interventional side. So we did almost 3 years of peripheral interventions before we got our coronary approval. Now, here's what's funny. It took us 3 years to build X amount of sales, and I can't remember exactly what that number was. Those 3 years of sales on the peripheral side were surpassed in 5 or 6 weeks on the coronary side. That's how important this product was on the coronary side. And so our business all of a sudden quadrupled almost overnight.
So everybody wanted it on the coronary side that did both coronary and peripheral procedures. But I remember being skeptical in the periphery because the TAVR operators would plop it up, a 7-millimeter balloon, and expand it 2 to 4 atmospheres. And I'd say, yeah, of course it expanded. I mean, the artery is literally bigger than that balloon. Then you guys did come out with bigger balloons, and I became a believer as I used it in the periphery. And once we got in the coronary space, the way it's changed the paradigm literally is
Crazy.
2 things: the reimbursement and being able to open up a vessel at low atmospheres.
Try.
There are a lot of cardiologists that are not trained to go above rated burst pressure. Like, that didn't exist for them. Whereas like Bill and I were taught, like, you just keep going until it expands, get up to the B on the Boston, on the,
Right.
be able to pitch a balloon in and just put 4 atmospheres and watch it open up. I mean, it's lovely. There were deliverability issues that are getting better all the time with your new limited mercury release, and it'll keep getting better, but it's completely changed the game.
I even heard that there may have been operators that actually used the peripheral IVL balloon in the coronary before they had the coronary device. I can't imagine doing that.
Can't imagine either. Hey, that is a matter. I think I had to throw my cell phone away when that doctor sent me that off-label case, and I didn't want any anywhere close to me. I did not promote this. Do not send me any more pictures. Like,
I'm just trying to help the patient.
right. So here's an interesting segue just to play off of your last question. There are also startups like the ones that Jordy and I are involved with now, where there's no hope for reimbursement. And so you have to think about your value proposition and define it in different ways, right? And so just because there's no pathway to reimbursement doesn't necessarily mean that there's not still a pathway to success, right? And so when you think about some of those indicators for success for us would be like at CRT, which is one of our big cardiology conferences. 3 years ago, you'd have never seen a presentation on radiation safety, not one. There were 15 or 16 presentations on radiation safety because physicians have now been doing this long enough that we're seeing the long-term impact of these sort of workplace hazards, right? I mean, that's a strong term, but that's what it is, right? Some of our biggest legends in our space are now walking with a limp, or they've had cancer treatment because of the situation that they had to work in. And so it's a good example about where sometimes the need on the startup side can be big enough that the reimbursement piece doesn't have to be fully in place in order for you to still be successful. So, I mean, my prediction is within probably somewhere in that 7-8 year time frame, there won't be a single cath lab, vascular surgery suite, IR suite that won't have expanded radiation protection because you guys, as the operators, are going to refuse to work there, right? At the end of the day, you deserve to have the protection. And sometimes your startup can just be one of these demand issues, right? You'd never go into a construction site without a hard hat. Why would you go back into the fluoro suite without having expanded radiation protection? So, I use that just as an example about there are times where your strategy may look a little different simply because the need is that big and it's that important that you don't have to have all the other pieces figured out. Now, we still got to go raise money to get this business off the ground. But the way that we would approach venture capital with this business and the way that we approached it with Rampart, I served on the board for 3 years before I decided to come back into the operational side. And so we had to go out and raise money. And when we sat down with the venture capital community, it was all about need. It was not around how we get to a reimbursement stage. It was about, this is an absolutely big need and it's going to happen. Do you want to be a part of that movement or not? And we found the right partner for that.
So I have conversations with Bob Foster about this every time I see him. I actually apologized to him at CRT this year. I said, every time I see you, we talk for like an hour and a half, and I don't want to take up your time, sir. Live dosimetry needs to happen. And he argued why it'll eventually go away. And I said, that's fine. We still need it now. We need everybody to know your dose during every single case so that you can, one, change your behavior, learn about your product, whether you have Egg Nest or whether you have Rampart or whether you have AeroShield or whether you have nothing, just your Mavic Shield. To know, I think we need to collect that data on as many people as humanly possible live. So I don't know. I think some people are looking towards that, but I'm passionate about that one thing. And then eventually the table needs to we need to redesign. I can't say too much about what I'm about to say because it's somebody else's idea and I don't want to do that to them. But there's going to be a way in the future where, you know how your car has a really nice audio system? We used to buy tape decks that we'd put in. Eventually, this just needs to be built in, part of the table, part of the fluoro, new ideas. That's where it'll really, be standard of care.
Totally agree with you 100%, Brian. The problem is we've still got about 4,000 labs out there right now that are not scheduled to be turned over, and people are doing the majority of their cases in those labs. And so our thing is we're going to be a part of, one of the 3 companies that are out there are probably going to be a part of most every new lab. But the problem is 80% of the cases being done right now are not in a brand new lab. And so we got to fix it for the people that are doing cases in the other labs too.
Even brand new labs, they're not going to solve this for a while. So even though I said, hey, there's a way to get there, I think we're 20 years away from the idea I just said.
I hope not, but you may be right. We're being very aspirational with our goals.
Yes.
All right, Jeff, where would kind of tie it up, kind of summarize your experience, or if you could, somebody says, hey, I have an idea, what do I do next? What would you tell those people?
I think it's, I used to call it the startup rodeo, get going and try and hang on for at least 8 years.
Wow. Yeah. What's a reasonable time frame for this kind of stuff?
I started 2004, gotten things down in the notebook, and we got FDA approval in 2018.
And for every one of those, there's probably 3 that haven't, or more, that didn't make it that far.
A lot more.
Yeah. It's at best 1 in 10 and probably 1 in 100. Now, one of the things that we kind of hit on a little bit is people, when they have a new idea, the second thing they probably ought to come up with is a business plan. I see decks every day, and it's like, well, where's the business plan? You got to have a business plan, whether it's like Rob was just talking about, whether it's an unseen need. And that's one of those things, radiation, people don't even know what they don't know about how much better it's going to be when you don't have to deal with that all the time. And I think robotics kind of kicked that off when all of a sudden you could be sitting in the other room driving a joystick and doing a case. It's like, whoa, that's like, and not wearing lead and not having all that radiation stuff. So, and then there was, more what I did, which is, you kind of try to solve, a medical problem, but they're all different varieties of how these work, but they all need a business plan, and you've got to get that early so that you really understand it, so you can navigate all these near-death experiences. And that's exactly what they are. You kind of, like we talked about, you solve a problem or you're done, and you don't move to the next square.
Hey, Rob. So people approach me, and I'm sure they approach Brian that work in the industry, and they say, hey, I've been asked to look at this position with this startup. And it's always, now sometimes I have intimate knowledge of the startup and I can tell them if I think it's going to work or not, at least from my perspective, not code and all that stuff. But that's got to be somewhat challenging to hire people to come work in a startup if you don't know it's going to be successful. I mean, how do you do that?
It's true. So I think the first thing we do is we look for a certain DNA, right? You have to have a level of risk tolerance to come over and gamble with your career to go start with a company that you just don't know if that proof of concept is going to work or not. So I think there is, when I'm recruiting and putting a sales team together, I'm looking for people that have some of that risk tolerance. I'm looking for folks that are mission minded. They're looking at this and saying, hey, if we can really get people out of lead because we protect them so well from radiation, I really don't care about how much risk's involved. I believe so strongly in that idea that I want to come do this. Same thing with deep wall calcium at Shockwave, right? People believe so strongly in that concept and the fact that they had a chance to be a part of a true standard changing technology that they're willing to take a little bit of that risk. Right now, most of the time it's not young folks, right? It's usually a little bit older folks that have had a few of those crappy sales jobs where there's 14 other products that do the same thing that they do. And if they lower their price by 10 cents, maybe they can go get a contract. Those are bad jobs, guys. I mean, they really are. So when you think about, there's some risk taking, there's also the trade-off is this beautifully exciting, innovative. You have a chance to be part of the feedback loop to the owners of the company. I used to love to get my sales team together and get Doug Godshall on the call and just say, hey guys, let's give Doug some real feedback, right? He needs to hear what our customers are seeing. He needs to hear about the patient outcomes, because when Doug's confident, he's going to be going in front of venture capital into banking, and he's going to go get that money for us and make sure that we can take that next step. But I think there's a DNA you're looking for. There's a belief system that you're looking for. There's a little bit of risk tolerance that you've got to find. And then you've got to be able to articulate the value proposition. That was my job, is that could I get them enthusiastic enough that they were going to come here and run through walls for us? And really at the end of the day, it wasn't just about a paycheck, even though there's a chance to make some pretty good money when you work in the startup business. It's about patient solutions. Can we elevate the experience and the outcome that patients have in the space? And if you can, is that worth taking the risk over?
All right. Any final questions, Brian?
I appreciate you both being on. This is great.
A lot of fun talking with you guys. So look forward to getting together next time I out and around.
Yeah, let's order some coffee. I got some ideas. I'll talk to you.
Anybody going to Sky in Montreal?
Shockwave Blue? No.
Probably not.
That'll work sometime.
I got Maxi Blair evening. I'll see you at NCVH for sure.
Jordy, you see why did you be there? Speak French, Jordy?
Not enough to make it to Montreal. I speak enough to be at NCVH in New Orleans, though.
All right, I'll be there. So
That's a different French down there. That's crazy.
That's right.
all right. Well, I really appreciate you guys being on. John will edit, and I'll let you guys know when it's available, and we'll send it to all your friends and family and all your company and everything. Appreciate the time.
Hey, thanks for us. Enjoyed it.
Dr. Hull, Rob, thank you all very much. Another edition of Blue Collar ICs signing off. We'll be back with you next time. Make sure to like, share, subscribe. This week's podcast brought to you by Salus Scientific. And remember, our special thanks to RealWorks Media. We'll talk to you next week.
You've been listening to Blue Collar ICs, real conversations from the front lines of interventional cardiology. Special thanks to hosts Jordy Collada, Bill Dixon, Brian Brown, and Todd Floor for sharing their insight, experience, and perspective. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and share the show. Join us next time for more real-world cardiology, only on Blue Collar ICs. Blue Collar ICs is a production of the RealWorks Media Network, Tallahassee, Florida,